I'm speaking tonight about the tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice. As with Shylock and Morocco in Merchant of Venice, so with Othello, Shakespeare is minimally concerned with race, ethnicity, and religion as significant categories in themselves. In the catalogue of men, he uses them instead as moral and spiritual symbols. As Shylock is condemned for his evil behavior, of which his religion is to Shakespeare's Christian audience a symbol, and as Morocco is rejected for his complexion, which includes his moral as well as physical makeup, so Othello is not portrayed as evil because he is a blackamoor. He is, on the contrary, portrayed as noble and magnificent. But he is a man, indeed, in a sense, Adam, and like all men, he has choices. It is alone the choices he makes that cause his character to correspond, when it might well have contrasted, with the color of his skin, the traditional color of the devil. Iago, to make trouble, calls Othello old black ram and thick lips. But the Duke says to Brabantio, "If virtue no delighted beauty lack, your son-in-law is far more fair than black." There seem to be many readers of Othello who believe Othello's final self-portrait, one that loved not wisely but too well, to be not only noble but evidently true. And yet the phrase itself contains an irresolvable paradox. How can one who loves not wisely love well? What can it mean to love too well? The phrase seems to be logically impossible and hence reveals the perplexity, the moral blindness from which Othello, for all his magnificence, never ceases to suffer. Othello is pretending to admit his own fallibility, but cannot do so truly. Not wisely is true, but too well is the hopeless grasping at the straw of false nobility. Loving well is precisely what Othello fails to do. In fact, the play is more tragic than many have thought, in being the portrayal of the damnation of a seemingly noble soul. In Act 5, Scene 2, Othello has two soliloquies. The first is exquisite, ceremonial, portentously calm. The second is excited, abruptly vacillating, stark. Both give voice to the conflict in Othello between his love for Desdemona and his determination to kill her. Together, they bracket the dialogue during which the actual killing takes place, and doing so give form to three different but congruent dramatic conflicts. The first and most explicit conflict is that between Othello's intense and opposed devotions. He loves Desdemona, and yet he is convinced that he must kill her. The conflict is revealed in phrases like, "Yet I'll not shed her blood, yet she must die. So sweet was ne'er so fatal. Cruel tears." And, my wife, what wife? I have no wife." This conflict reaches sublime pathos in "Be thus when thou art dead, and I will kill thee and love thee after." The second dramatic conflict is a conflict that the audience feels in hearing Othello's thought and seeing his actions, while all along knowing Desdemona to be guiltless. We feel the disparity first between what we know and what Othello knows. He would not be intending murder if he knew about Desdemona, what we know, namely that she is innocent. And this disparity also intensifies in us the opposition of the two essential responses to all play watching and all art, empathy and psychic distance. The tension between the urge to cry out, "Stop, you fool, she's innocent," and the knowledge that we must not cry out because this is, after all, only a play. We know that what is happening is wrong, and equally that it will happen unless we stop it. But we cannot stop it without destroying the experience and its meaning. Our own experience of this conflict between empathy and psychic distance reenacts Othello's conflict between his love of Desdemona and his murderous intent. The third of the dramatic conflicts revealed in these lines gives shape to the entire play. It is not readily visible to modern audiences who fail to realize that for Shakespeare's audience, the most central images of the play are not merely images, but literal realities. And the fact that Othello himself is not aware of this third and deepest conflict is a major part of the drama. What is this conflict? In the ceremonial soliloquy before the murder, Othello imagines himself as justice and his act of killing as a heavenly sorrow. In the excited soliloquy after the murder, Othello perceives his now accomplished act as a universal alteration, one that warrants eclipses and earthquakes. But in the act itself, Othello is a furious, hating, jealous avenger, maddened in the instant by Desdemona's supposed brazen weeping for Cassio. He kills not the cunningest pattern of excelling nature, but a strumpet, as he thinks. So this deepest conflict is between Othello's image of his act and the act itself, between the judge and the avenger, between the supposed reasonableness of his choice to kill and the passionate violence of the killing. What has previously been hinted at in the play is here made dramatically clear. Othello's delusion is deeper and more serious than the mistaken notion that Desdemona is false. Othello is deluded about his own humanity, for he thinks himself in judgment divine when we see that he is not. Othello's extreme pride lies in his thinking it is up to him to judge guilty even where heaven would forgive. I would not kill thy soul, he says, and it is not mercy, but delusion. For even in the face of the heavenly mercy in relation to her soul to which he recommends Desdemona, Othello can imagine no mercy in relation to the killing of her body. The Elizabethan would feel a chill at Othello's, quote, "this sorrow's heavenly." All the more because Desdemona is innocent, but not only because she is. That a jealous man who has killed his wife as a strumpet should then look for the same responses from the earth and sky that accompanied the crucifixion of Christ will move an Elizabethan audience not only to sorrow for the wife, but to abhor the delusion of the avenger and see terrible irony in his exaggerated self-importance. The modern audience might see the conflict in terms of betrayed nobility, but cutting away Othello's own responsibility and blaming the racist devil Iago alone, which amounts to a kind of affirmative action of literary criticism, robs the play of its deepest applicability to our lives. Shakespeare's audience would have seen in this imagery a war between delusion and truth, between pride and love, blind will and reason. Of course, Iago is the efficient cause of Othello's destruction. But the play is the tragedy of Othello, not of Iago. And to strip it of Othello's own share of responsibility for his end is to miss Shakespeare's most essential dramatic point. The drama here is a drama of Othello's soul. Othello is in some ways the most emblematic of Shakespeare's tragedies. Desdemona is not only a virtuous wife, but a representative of Venice, a good angel, a sacrificial victim, and a symbol of the soul. Iago is not only a man, but an ensign or standard bearer, an evil angel, a devil, and jealousy itself. There are subtle and complex contrasts between the black and white of face and soul. There is the emblematic contrast between good Christian Venetians and evil infidel Turks. There is a prodigal use of the imagery of the soul, of angels and devils, of heaven and hell, of salvation and damnation. Iago's name probably meant to recall Santiago, St. James, that is, of Compostela, the Moor-slaying patron of Catholic Spain. Desdemona's name is, in Greek, unfortunate or ill-starred, but also by a somewhat different derivation, twice miraculous, marvelous, heaven-sent. The name of Othello may be derived from a variant spelling of Ottoman, and Il Moro di Venezia, the Moor of Venice, where Turk and Moor were synonyms, was the title of an acrobat who in the 13th century walked a dangerous high rope strung between the campanile and the loggia of the Doge's palace. Michael Cassio's name recalls the archangel Michael, the warrior against Lucifer, and Cassius, an upright judge of ancient Rome. There are the hellish wedding vows of Othello and Iago in Act 3, Scene 3, and there is the violent divorce of Act 5. All these carry weight for an audience for whom damnation and salvation, the possible fall of Europe to the Turk, and the enemy power of Catholic Spain were very real concerns. These emblematic elements in Othello in no way mar the truth to life of the characters and situations. It is precisely the seamless union of these two apparently antagonistic modes of literary expression that constitutes one of Shakespeare's greatest gifts. Graham Huff uses the adjective incarnational of this harmony of abstract idea and particular personality in action. My effort here is not to discount the realistic aspect so dear to modern directors, but to restore balance by recalling the often overlooked part that emblem and abstraction play in that harmony. The Venetians and the Turks are one set of emblems that illuminate the deep issues of the play. Act 1, Scene 1 has introduced us to Iago and his treachery. Scene 2 to Othello's noble bearing and mistaken trust in Iago. Scene 3 begins with what may seem at first mere exposition, a discussion about the Turkish threat to Cyprus, debated among the Venetian signory and punctuated by messages from the galleys. It is stated that the Turks, in numbers uncertain, are making for Cyprus. The Duke says, "Nay, it is possible enough to judgment. I do not so secure me in the error, but the main article I do approve in fearful sense." Then comes the report sent by one Angelo that the Turks are moving not to Cyprus but to Rhodes. There follows a substantial speech that argues the improbability of the latest news. Immediately after, the Duke agrees with the first senator's conclusion that the Rhodes campaign is a ruse. More news arrives, confirming their conclusion. The Turks are sailing to Cyprus in fact. Enter Brabantio, Othello, Iago, and the rest. What is going on here emblematically? Brabantio, a senator, has just been correctly informed in Scene 1 by Iago, the honest messenger, that his daughter, Cyprus, has been captured by the Moor, Turk, who appears, however, in Scene 2 to be of noble bearing and, though black-faced, white-spirited, that is, Venetian. And a Turk, Iago, has sought to attack a Cyprus, Othello, by pretending to be making for Rhodes. Now look at the first senator's words at line 17. "This cannot be by no assay of reason. 'Tis a pageant to keep us in false gaze." How does he know? The answer is that he reasons it out. The Turk is not so stupid as to ignore that Cyprus is the more weakly fortified of the two islands, nor will he so suddenly have altered his nature from malevolent to benign. The Rhodes business must be a trick, the Turk's intentions no less threatening for seeming to be altered. In fact, in this very seeming lies the greatest threat to the undiscerning. Reason thus brings the senator to the correct conclusion, which is confirmed by messengers from the trusty Montano. The signory then chooses to protect Cyprus from the Turks by sending Othello to defend it, whereupon, when he gets there, he is not required even to engage them, for a tempest drowns the enemy fleet. The senator's speech is emblematic of the exercise of reason and good judgment. The storm is emblematic of heaven's intervention on behalf of the right. Storms were significant in the destruction of the Spanish armadas a few years before. The name of the unseen character who sent the report of the feigned Turkish move to Rhodes was Angelo, that is, angel or messenger. And the whole story suggests that when both false messages and true ones are presented to the judgment, man's obligation is to judge rightly between them based on main articles, however unwelcome the true conclusion appears, whereupon heaven will see to the rest. Crucially, Othello is absent from these deliberations of the Signory. Othello fails in relation to Iago, where the Duke and senators do not fail in relation to the Turks. Othello is himself an unfortified Cyprus, but one that lacks a discerning government. Not seeing Iago's honesty as a deceptive feint to Rhodes, he leaves himself open to attack. What exactly is Othello's failure? Until Act 3, there are no actual failures, but there are emblematic ones. In Act 1, Scene 2, his bearing, though admirably dignified, is also disproportionately proud. For Othello claims that not only his parts and his title shall manifest me rightly, but also my perfect soul. A Christian audience would have observed this statement to be a doctrinal error, a dangerous habit of mind, and an act of pride in itself. A second emblematic error comes in Act 2, Scene 1, after the destruction of the Turkish fleet. Cassio has landed and exclaimed about Othello, "Oh, let the heavens give him defense against the elements, for I have lost him on a dangerous sea." It is a sea that is so rough as to be confused with the sky, a sea whose tempest prefigures the confusion of heaven and hell, of Desdemona and Iago, into which Othello will be drawn if Iago's plans proceed. What defense might the heavens give to a man in such a condition? Not the miraculous one given the angel Desdemona and the demon Iago, who traversed the enchafed flood with supernatural ease. But a human defense is given. Montano asks, is he well shipped? Cassio answers, his bark, meaning his ship, is stoutly timbered, and his pilot a very expert and approved allowance. The pilot who brings Othello through the confusion of sea and sky is an emblem of reason and good judgment, the judgment the senators applied in discerning the true from the false messages about the Turks. The judgment necessary, too, though not sufficient for, the Turks' defeat. It is reason alone, the highest of man's parts, that can pilot Othello to safety in the confusion of messages that Iago, that most consummate Turk, designs. But what happens the moment that Othello sets foot on shore? First, he sees Desdemona and is overcome with profound surprise to see that she has crossed the tempestuous sea so quickly and easily ahead of him. He is joyously moved and speaks of his absolute content. What we have here is a picture of heaven, what ought to take place in paradise if all goes well and Desdemona and Othello cross the tempest of this life as successfully as they have just crossed the sea. Desdemona, having an easier passage, will be there to greet the storm-tossed Othello, whose ship, his body, and pilot, his mind, will nevertheless have brought him safely to the heavenly port. Yet in the expression of this image of what is possible lies the threat to its fulfillment, the hidden serpent in this version of Eden. For this is not the last haven in fact, but only in prefiguration. And Othello errs in imagining his happiness with Desdemona to be itself the ultimate possible bliss of his soul. If it were now to die, 'twere now to be most happy. For I fear my soul hath her content so absolute, that not another comfort like to this succeeds in unknown fate. Though this images the heaven which ought to succeed in unknown fate, strictly read, this is a kind of blasphemy, the mistaking of temporal for eternal bliss. It is a failure of humility, a dangerous thing for a Christian to say. Desdemona is joy, but not the soul's absolute content. Desdemona herself must restore the right perspective in the right words. She says, "The heavens forbid, but that our loves and comforts should increase, even as our days do grow." In spite of which correction, Othello will nonetheless cause his fear, here still a misjudgment, to come true, his loves and comforts to decrease. Second, there is another emblematic error when Othello turns to Iago and says, "I prithee, good Iago, go to the bay and disembark my coffers. Bring thou the master to the citadel. He is a good one, and his worthiness does challenge much respect." He commends, that is, not only his wealth, but also the master of the ship into the hands of the evil ensign. The gesture prefigures Othello's error in thinking to remain safe and happy with Desdemona after resigning his pilot, Reason, the master of the ship, to Iago. Cassio offers an emblem of the opposite possibility when he says, "Iago hath direction what to do, but notwithstanding with my personal eye will I look to it." Cassio's one word, "notwithstanding," is contained, in that word is contained all of man's responsibility. In matters where one is responsible and discretion is essential, one must not resign his personal attention. And it is as true in the guarding of one's soul as in the guarding of one's town. But Othello's response is, Iago is most honest, thus asserting what we know to be false. He cannot yet know the evil of Iago, but he has betrayed to the audience his fallibility. The dark side of Othello's magnificence is the dangerous propensity to assume perfection not only in Iago, but in his own judgment. After the drunken brawl orchestrated by Iago, which is Cassio's fall, Othello enters and says, furious, of course, "Now by heaven, my blood begins my safer guides to rule, and passion, having my best judgment collied, assays to lead the way. If I once stir, or do but lift this arm, the best of you shall sink in my rebuke." Collied means darkened, as if with coal dust or soot. Passion having my best judgment collied. After hearing the facts as slanted by Iago, Othello says, "I know, Iago, thy honesty and love doth mince this matter, making it light to Cassio. Cassio, I love thee, but nevermore be officer of mine. Look if my gentle love be not raised up. I'll make thee an example." Shakespeare's making him an example for us. Othello's judgment of Cassio is correct. But when he later seeks to apply his military excellence to matters of love, relying on a soldier witness and ocular proofs in the judgment of his wife, his judgment will indeed be collied by his passion. In fact, by his passion for his own judgment. And for the second time, and then unjustly, he will strike where he doth love. Having thus been prepared by the emblems and the dramatic prefiguring of Othello's fault, we now experience it in fact in the great temptation scene, Act 3, Scene 3. The scene begins with Cassio's resignation of the matter of his reinstatement into the inappropriate hands of Desdemona. And this indiscretion of Cassio's is Iago's cue to begin the major assault. "Ha! I like not that." A few lines later, Desdemona, compressing into 6 words the main themes of the play, says about Cassio, "For if he be not one that truly loves you, that errs in ignorance and not in cunning, I have no judgment in an honest face." Cassio errs in ignorance and not in cunning, and he truly loves Othello. Desdemona does have judgment in an honest face. On the other side, Iago errs in cunning. His honest face is dishonest, being the mask of a dishonest mind. And Othello falls because he will entertain no such ifs. Where his judgment now threatens to implicate his love, he will cashier the claims of love as he has cashiered Cassio. He will not learn what love should teach him, that one may both love and err as Cassio does, both hate and seem to love as Iago does, both seem just and be perplexed as he will be himself. And, crucially, when Othello does learn to imagine that one may seem to be what he is not, it is because he has already failed to discover it about himself that he comes to believe it about Desdemona rather than about Iago. The claims of love ignored, his good judgment, which should teach one's own fallibility, goes into Iago's hands, and he will believe Iago's lie and disbelieve Desdemona's truth. I'll see before I doubt, when I doubt, prove, he says. And then away with love or jealousy. This is deluded, not only because innocence can never be proven, hence our law courts presume innocence until guilt is proven, but because there is no suggestion in it of possible faulty seeing or proving in himself. Othello trusts that his own knowledge is absolute, or that if it is not, it can be made so with ocular proof. And when Othello at line 256 says, "Fear not my government," we cannot help seeing that once the government of reason fails within Othello, his government of others must do so too. In fact, Othello's pride becomes the tool of Iago's government. For it is precisely the man who cannot imagine himself to be in error who will continue to say of such a one as Iago, after what he has hinted about such a one as Desdemona, "This fellow's of exceeding honesty, and knows all qualities with a learned spirit of human dealings." Iago knows some of the qualities of human dealings, indeed, but not with a learned spirit, and it is his dishonesty which is fatally exceeding. Desdemona cannot, and Iago will not prove what they are to Othello's judgment with ocular proof. Both call for an act of faith from Othello. But Othello chooses to judge his beloved in the light of facts rather than facts in the light of his love, imagining that he can possess certainty based on proof when he will recognize no certainty based on faith. He tries the spirit in the court of the fallen world, and the verdict is inevitable. The spirit will be found guilty. Othello's fault, now as later, is to think that he knows the opposite of what his faith should teach him to believe. To love Desdemona thus unwisely is not to love well. As Othello has until recently been a soldier and not a lover, a pagan and not a Christian, a fighter for the signory and not a deliberator with it, so he has not been called upon to resolve doubts through love, through faith, through that reasoning and humility which teaches one to doubt appearances and one's own perceptions. Until now, he could always afford to take his own perceptions for truth, the faces of men as honest images of their souls, and so he has come to have perfect faith in his own judgment. But a lover, a Christian, and a truly reasonable man will be reminded when doubt arises that a man's knowledge is limited, his judgment fallible, and that there are two paths to the resolution of doubt, knowledge and faith. Where there can be knowledge, there must be. Where there cannot, there must be faith. Othello is now a husband, a Christian, and a governor, and yet he will not surrender the image of his own absolute capacity for resolving doubt. In love he would fight, in faith he would prove, in government he judges by facts alone. The signory first recognized that the Turk would not act contrary to his own nature and intentions, and then expressed faith in the message of Montano, your trusty and most valiant servitor, as he praised them to do. The reward for the sound reasoning, correct judgment illuminated by faith, was grace, the Turk-destroying tempest. By contrast, the price Othello pays for trusting another soldier's calumnies and supposed proofs against his own wife, rather than her own constant loving nature, in other words, for the pride of recognizing no limits to his own discernment, is a fall from grace. Iago says, "Not poppy, nor mandragora, nor all the drowsy syrups of the world shall ever medicine thee to that sweet sleep which thou owedst yesterday." In juxtaposing how reason operates in Desdemona with how it fails in Iago and Othello, the play conveys that faith and love are essential to right reason. The devil's mirror image of this truth is to be found over and over in Iago's words to Roderigo, which consistently reveal that Iago's reasoning is incapable of admitting any true good or virtue. Acts of kindness or love are incomprehensible to him. He can imagine one man serving another only out of selfishness, either stupidly, for naught but provender, or treacherously, and such a one do I profess myself. He can see no point to true service for love, cannot even imagine the meaning of the words truly followed, though he utters them. A virtuous woman of good qualities he can see no reason to love, finding her fit only to suckle fools and chronicle small beer. That Desdemona's love for Othello can be no more than a momentary attraction to his bragging, that she must inevitably become bored with Othello and turn to one like Cassio to satisfy her lust, that there is no such thing in Desdemona as blessed condition, that the paddling of palms must signify lechery, all this is as clear to Iago as it is that wine is made of grapes. His spiritual blindness about reason and love is summed up in Act 1, Scene 3. If the beam of our lives had not one scale of reason to poise another of sensuality, the blood and baseness of our natures would conduct us to most preposterous conclusions. But we have reason to cool our raging motions, our carnal stings, our unbitted lusts, whereof I take this that you call love to be a sect or scion. It is merely a lust of the blood and a permission of the will. Iago here reveals his ignorance of the true nature of love in an exercise of false reason. He believes himself to be fully reasonable, to have replaced love, which is lust, with reason. But the audience sees that to reduce love to a scion of lust is to pervert the reason and fall prey to hate. Iago has called the will the gardener of the self. He recognizes that it is up to the will to control the passions, but recognizes no purpose for which this should be done except the will itself, and no higher power by which the will's power is delegated. He seems to be proclaiming man's free will. In fact, since he admits no higher good than the passions of the mind, he is, as Philip Thompson has said, passion and the sophist of passion. For he does not see that without love, even what he calls reason is merely lust. Othello is then won over by Iago to the same unreasonable blindness, taking mere appearances to be proof of Desdemona's falsehood and reducing the true love of her to a mere appearance. Too proud of himself and his reputation to bear the idea of being a cuckold, once persuaded that he is one, he imagines that he can dispense justice while dispensing with mercy. But where reason is not guided by love, reason itself fails as pilot, and the end is shipwreck. The audience observes that from him who hath not love shall be taken away even the judgment he hath. Notice how differently Desdemona reasons in response to the ocular proof of Othello's displeasure, even of his faithlessness. He's been beating her up in his angry jealousy. And she says, "Nay, we must think men are not gods, nor of them look for such observancy as fits the bridal. Beshrew me much, Emilia. I was, unhandsome warrior as I am, arraigning his unkindness with my soul. But now I find I had suborned the witness, and he's indicted falsely. This is how it is possible to respond to the suspicion of unkindness. Of course, she's wrong. He is being unkind, and she hasn't misjudged him, but she doesn't know it. And she chooses to respond with love. Thus, reason may pilot the soul through the tempests of the world, illuminated by love, which operates in Desdemona here precisely because, loving Othello, she is able to think men are not gods, to recognize her own fallibility. Where there is love, there is humility, and where there is humility, reason serves. But where pride defeats love, reason too is betrayed, and so betrays. Hence, the common description of the play as a drama of jealousy is insufficient. As revenge is in Hamlet, so in Othello, jealousy is a particular instance of a more fundamental and general condition. It is the life and death, and to a Christian audience, the salvation and damnation issue of pride. Let us now return to the soliloquy at Act 5, Scene 2. The last words we have heard Othello speak previously are these. Minion, your dear lies dead. He thinks that Cassio has been killed by Iago. Minion, your dear lies dead, and your unblessed fate hies. Strumpet I come. Forth of my heart those charms thine eyes are blotted. Thy bed, lust-stained, shall with lust's blood be spotted. Try to get your mouth to say those lines, and you will find them slow and laborious, even clotted. I keep using the word clotted because it rhymes with blotted and spotted. When Othello next appears, he speaks with orderly calm. No longer the jealous avenger, he appears as a priest of sacrifice, as justice itself. We have seen that this self-image breaks down again in the act of killing. But in this soliloquy, we have the third of the three conflicts I spoke of earlier. The first being that between Othello's jealous hate and his love. The second, that between what Othello knows and what we, the audience, know. The third conflict is that between pride and humility, of which conflict Othello himself is unconscious. It is contained even in the first line. It is the cause, my soul. Cause means, in a strictly legal sense, the subject of litigation, and, by extension, the accusation. Speaking to his soul, as if to convince it of what it will not believe, Othello appeals to the distinction between the person of the criminal and the crime itself. Brutus had made a similar distinction in thinking about killing Caesar. Oh, that we then could come by Caesar's spirit and not dismember Caesar. Both realize that one cannot kill the cause without killing the person. To kill the person is to threaten one's own soul. And yet Othello cannot believe his soul anything but perfect, cannot imagine that the threat here is anything but the loss of Desdemona. Since his own judgment is perfect, as he believes, he will be able to sustain the necessary loss and to justify it. But now, having been prepared by all that has gone before, we hear in his images a falsity. He is not heavenly justice that may strike where it doth love. He is Iago. All Iago's soliloquies have been simple and straightforward, exhibiting no inner conflict, representing directly a pure and mysterious evil seeking a body in the world in the form of jealousy. Iago repeatedly and unconvincingly adduces particular motives for his demonic plans: lack of preferment, infidelity in his wife, lust for Desdemona, hatred of the Moor, etc. None is sufficient to justify his in fact self-motivated evil. Now Othello similarly attempts to justify to himself his plan. But surpassing Iago, he appropriates as the final guise of jealousy justice itself. The audience sees through the disguise. This justice, Othello's judgment, in taking itself to be infallible, proclaims itself to be false. While pretending to imitate divinity, it can imagine no mercy, and hence it appears to us as the hellish parody it is. When Othello says, "This sorrow's heavenly, it strikes where it doth love," though we believe in his sorrow, we see that he has killed his love, as he said he would in Act 3, well before killing his beloved. We are moved with pity, but it is pity for one who is not merely troubled, not merely in error, but falling into the depths of mortal sin. What appeared at first to be a noble, free, and open disposition now shows itself to be, in fact, what Iago rightly calls Othello's weakness. He thinks men honest that but seem to be so. Weakness becomes sin when he thinks himself honest, when he but seems even to himself to be so. He imagines he loves, but kills his love. He imagines he kills in justice, but kills in hatred. In choosing to kill Desdemona, he pretends to be God. In killing her, he shows himself to be a devil. This placing of his own will above God's, making it a god, is, as it was for Adam and for Lucifer before him, the fall. But Othello's killing of Desdemona does not expose his pride to himself, for he still would have the heavens darken and the earth shake in response to his loss. He mourns his loss, but is as deep as ever in his delusion. It is here that Emilia enters, and realizing what has happened and why Othello has killed Desdemona, accuses him first of being a devil, then of consummate stupidity. "O gull, O dolt, as ignorant as dirt, O murderous coxcomb, what should such a fool do with so good a wife?" Othello's self-adoring magnificence has come to this. It is Othello's ignorance, not of facts, but of love, that has turned him into a devil. He will not believe Emilia until the supposed facts themselves, the ocular proofs, are overturned by her testimony about the handkerchief. And it is then, when Othello finally believes his error, that the last contest of his soul begins. For the play is not the tragedy of Desdemona either. The final contest of Othello's soul, the heightening but also the extension of what it has been all along, only begins when he learns his mistake about Desdemona's guilt, supposed guilt. The question for Othello is, now that he has been forced to recognize his own error, can he also recognize through it his fallibility? Can he recognize that he, like all men, as the story of Adam's fall reminds us, is constitutionally imperfect? That, as Desdemona herself says, we must think men are not gods. Can Othello now learn to submit his pride in his own judgment to the only infallible judgment and unfailing love there is, that of divinity? The last part of Act 5, Scene 2 is a picture of Othello's answer. It is no. The delusion remains, and damnation is its end. At the height of Othello's agonized yet self-justifying suffering over the death of Desdemona, Gratiano, whose name is also emblematic, speaks of Brabantio, Desdemona's father. "Poor Desdemon, I am glad thy father's dead. Thy match was mortal to him, and pure grief shore his old thread in twain. Did he live now, this sight would make him do a desperate turn, yea, curse his better angel from his side, and fall to reprobance." The words apply equally to Othello. In the loose sense, Othello has already done a desperate turn, cursed his better angel from his side, and fallen to reprobance. He has despaired of Desdemona's fidelity and desperately cursed her from him by killing her. But the words have a strict sense as well. Reprobance is, in Elizabethan parlance, damnation. And the final act of despair is suicide. The words mean that had Brabantio lived to see this sight, he would have committed suicide and so assured his damnation. This is precisely what Othello does. He refuses to imagine mercy for himself, trusts his own infallible judgment, and kills himself. Whereupon Gratiano, the voice of grace itself, remarks, "All that is spoke is marred." Hence, the language of the play refutes the common modern notion expressed in Bullock's representative conclusion. He writes, "Othello executes justice on himself, now knows the depths of his own nature, but in the simple grandeur of his farewells regains his nobility and much of the romantic glamour with which Shakespeare invested him before his fall." This is simply wishful thinking, untrue to the text. It is true that we do not hate Othello, in fact pity him and long for his illumination. Nor are we permitted the opportunity to feel morally superior to him. Perhaps this is why so many critics insist on Othello's nobility throughout. But to do so is to confuse high seriousness of condition and strength of purpose with virtue. At the end of the play, the operative emotions in us are not sadness and admiration in the modern sense, but as Shakespeare put it in Hamlet, woe and wonder. A deeply felt pity for Othello, accompanied nonetheless by horror at his fate, both earthly and eternal. The clearest demonstration that Othello not only should, but could have altered his judgment about his own damnation lies in the fact that he had in effect ocular proof of the contrary, that is, of the possibility of salvation. In Act 5, Scene 2, Othello cries out, about Desdemona. He sees her on the bed, dead. "O ill-starred wench, pale as thy smock, when we shall meet at Compt, this look of thine will hurl my soul from heaven, and fiends will snatch at it." Compt, or count, means the last judgment. He goes on to cry out that he deserves damnation. "Blow me about in winds, roast me in sulfur, wash me in steep down gulfs of liquid fire." In doing so, he commits the sin of despair, in the face not only of Christian teaching, but of ocular proof of mercy. For Desdemona's dying words were love's forgiveness itself. Emilia has asked, who hath done this deed? Desdemona, with her last breath, replies, "Nobody, I myself. Farewell. Commend me to my kind Lord. Oh, farewell." These words do not send her, as Othello says, like a liar to burning hell, but make her, in Emilia's words, the more angel, one who has died expressing the very capacity to pity Othello for which he first loved her. It is this messenger of mercy, of the possibility of forgiveness in the face of his own certainty of damnation, that Othello curses from his side by believing himself to be damned by her look. The belief that one is certainly damned is the worst sin of all, the sin of despair, another form of pride. The forgiveness of Desdemona makes Othello's despair and suicide all the more heinous, dramatically and morally. For if she can so forgive, or if not forgive, at least not accuse, she doesn't want harm to come to him, so she won't tell Emilia the truth at the last moment. How much greater must be the mercy of God? But Othello will have even the fate of his soul his own way. As in the face of Desdemona's love and fidelity, he has trusted himself to kill her, so now in the face of her proof of mercy, he trusts himself to kill himself. And it is no longer a question of being wrought to perplexity by Iago. His final choice is his alone, and his suicide alone mars all, for it alone eliminates the possibility of repentance and so assures his damnation. I began by suggesting that in Othello's last long speech, the phrase, "not wisely, but too well," exhibited the essence of his delusion. The image of his killing the Turk to defend the Venetian in this same last speech confirms the delusion. He says his last words, almost last words, and say besides that in Aleppo once, where a malignant and a turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him thus, and then he stabs himself. As the Venetian of this last tale has been Desdemona and the Turk Iago, so Othello has been both, ignorantly at war with himself. He imagines that he is the noble and brave protector of Venice, killing the Turk murderer of his wife, when in fact he is the Turk murderer, killing the Venetian, his soul. In thinking he is executing justice upon the circumcised and hence faithless flesh, Othello reveals the damnably uncircumcised heart. Iago cannot be killed, not only because he is a devil, but because Othello has made the Turk Iago triumphant. The only way to defeat the devil, Iago, is by overcoming the Turk in oneself, that is, by repenting. For the devil cannot be killed, but only shamed. But Othello does not repent of his sin of pride. In confessing his crime to damn himself, he only enters his sin more deeply. Thus the Turk remains the victor, and Iago is left alive. And Othello's earlier approbation of Iago's proud vow of silence, well, thou dost best, is the hint of his own course. His version of that satanic silence will be suicide. The final image that Othello charges the Venetians to use in recounting his story is that of one whose hand, like the base Judean, threw a pearl away richer than all his tribe. I'll come back to the Judean after a few minutes. One whose hand, like the base Judean, threw a pearl away richer than all his tribe. In this image, Othello again evokes the entire drama. For though he can see that his betrayal is like that of Judas, he fails again to learn from the analogy that his fate, like that of Judas, is in his own hands. He has thrown away a pearl of one sort in killing Desdemona, but the even more precious pearl, richer than all his tribe of Judas's, Turks, and Iagos, is his soul. To command respect on the basis of the nobility of the comparison with Judas is to indulge in the illusion that there is something to be proud of in having committed as great a crime, in having loved too well. In one sense, it is as great a crime, for Jesus says, "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these." But there can be nothing to boast of in having done evil to the least of these. More importantly, Othello is deluded because he is proudly damning himself by analogy rather than humbly learning by example. He refuses to see that he too is one of the least of these. Thus the play becomes a reenactment not only of the erring fall of disobedient man from original grace into the world of experience, but of the willed fall of the faithless man from that world into damnation. Finally, Desdemona is the pearl richer than all the tribe of Turks. Christ is the pearl richer than all the tribe of men. But the soul is the pearl richer than all the tribe of deluding images of ourselves that we cultivate in our pride. It is the pearl that Othello throws away in committing suicide, choosing to ignore both the forgiving act of his loving wife and the redeeming act of the betrayed Christ, who alone, as the audience believed, could purchase that pearl again, and to follow instead the example of the traitors, Judas and Iago. Othello, the insufficiently Christianized Moor, the Turk by analogy, the new Iago, the willfully ignorant man who thinks men, including himself, honest that but seem to be so, terrifies us in the end not only by his murder, by his fall, and by his perplexity, but preeminently by his self-fashioned damnation. His last words are these: I kissed thee ere I killed thee, no way but this, killing myself to die upon a kiss. He kisses Desdemona with the kiss of Judas before he kills her. In the end, he takes that kiss back to himself, divorcing himself from his beloved eternally by betraying his own soul to hell, as he has once before betrayed it to Iago. And the pity and the fear of it are that he does so still believing there is no way but this. Thank you very much. I said I would say something about the word Judean. There are two texts, early texts of this play, and it's one of the most convoluted and problematic of the textual problems in Shakespeare, because there's so many variants in the two different versions. And in one version, the word is Indian, and in the other, it's Judean, as if the N were turned upside down into a U. So the editors argue back and forth. Did Shakespeare really write like the base Indian, or did he really write like the base Judean? And I have a whole long argument about why I believe it's the base Judean is a much better reading, and you can see some of it in what I've said, because it fits the whole metaphorical, emblematic, thematic string of the play, and the base Indian is just kind of random and has almost nothing to do with anything. It does make a kind of sense, which is why the editors defend it, but I just think that Shakespeare meant Judean, and it just seems to me to hang together with the whole metaphorical structure of the play. So I want you to realize that Shakespeare does not work in the way that Dante does, with the same elaborated structure. What Brian is talking about is the 4 levels of interpretation that Dante suggests that we bring to the reading of the Divine Comedy, and they were the 4 levels that were brought to the reading of Scripture in the Middle Ages. And Dante builds that architecture extremely carefully and thoroughly throughout. Shakespeare is several hundred years later, and in England, and a kind of, by comparison with Dante, a romantic. And it's the liveliness of the reality of the people that grab us. Not that Dante didn't have that in moments, but there is always this moral significance to what he's talking about, but it's not worked out in the same architectural way. It's not worked out in the same almost mathematical way.
Yeah, I was just asking that because when we read Crossbow...
Because that is his last play, and it's the last speech of the last play, The Tempest, and it is probably the most allegorical and symbol weighed of Shakespeare's plays. So that in that final epilogue, yes, he's doing 4 layers of things, but you wouldn't exactly call it, anagogical and allegorical. There are 4 layers of sense to the words, and Shakespeare very often has 2 layers and sometimes 3, not so often 4, but it does happen. But there he just intentionally... It's rare to be quite so elaborated about the layering, yeah. And here the layering, I would say, is pretty much twofold. You have the story of the people, and then you have this whole sort of spiritual significance behind all of it going on. Other questions? Yes, John.
What do we know about the preconceptions of African people, black people in general, in Elizabeth?
Well,
I know there really weren't that many.
There weren't that many. There were some. I guess I'll answer the way Cunningham answered about ghosts in Hamlet. He said, if you want to know what Elizabethans thought about ghosts, read everything said about ghosts in Hamlet and believe it. So the same is true. Just if you read the language, you can see. In Merchant of Venice and here are mainly the two places. There is Aaron the Moor in Titus Andronicus, and he is a thoroughgoing villain too. He's sort of like a prototype of Iago. But the real villain here is not Othello in the beginning, it's Iago. And he's white and white and white, lily white Venetian. So the attitude for Shakespeare, at least, the attitude of the audience, was all over the map, of course. Some people were horrified, some people were prejudiced, some people never heard of it, some people thought, how is this possible? Some people said, oh, he's the color of the devil, he must be damned. But Shakespeare is not subscribing to that. He's using it as a metaphor more than anything, so that it is perfectly possible, and we must, in fact, believe that Othello might not be damned, because if we didn't believe that, it would give no bite to the choices that he makes and the actions that he takes. So it's not inevitable, and that's why we see him being tempted by Iago. But as I said, his color was thought to be the color of the devil, and if it's like the bastard in the Henry VI plays, and Edmund and King Lear. If you're a bastard, you have two choices. You can behave like a bastard and say, not my fault, I'm a bastard. Or you can behave like a good guy and disprove the bad reputation that bastards labor under. Edmund chooses to behave like a bastard. And at the very last moment of his life, on his deathbed, he changes. Some good I mean to do in despite of mine own nature, he says at the end. So that's Shakespeare telling us, okay, it's too bad you were born a bastard, but that doesn't mean you have to be damned as one, whatever people think. And the same is true of this. It's maybe an inferior race from the point of view of the lily white Englishman, or maybe it's just an oddity, and it's certainly the color of the devil. But let's see what you're made of, is Shakespeare's point of view. Let's see who you are and what you really do. And if you choose to behave like the devil, then that's your choice. It's not the fault of the skin.
Sort of built into that, isn't? And there's that speech about his past, and he's done all these amazing romantic adventures. Isn't it just partly that that's just another exotic part of
Yes.
this amazing God?
Absolutely, absolutely. In this play, his exoticism is one of the most important qualities, and it's sort of why Desdemona falls for him. She pities the suffering that he's gone through, and the heroism and the magnificence. And he is magnificent. Put up your swords, or for the dew will rust them. He's just standing there unafraid, and it's magnificent.
He's talking about his entire, everything he suffered, all the war, you think this backstory would make a great movie?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Whole backstory.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, if you were going to make a movie of this and not have it close in domestic comedy, you'd spend a lot of time on the first reel giving his background. That would be a wise thing to do for the younger audience. Yes?
This presentation that you've made is much more filled with imagery, allegory, and metaphor. I'm reminded of a story by Arthur C. Clarke in Childhood End about Shakespeare who miraculously comes back to life in modern day, takes a Shakespeare course and gets a C in it. The point I'm trying to make is, are we possibly overthinking Shakespeare? And aside from the beautiful language and poetry and everything, why do we know, or how is it that he has sparked so much rumination on so many layers? Is it there, or are you guys just making it up to get tenure?
All right, so the first part of the answer is, if you set Arthur C. Clarke against Shakespeare, I'm going to pick Shakespeare. Because Arthur C. Clarke in that image is being piggy. The reality is that you know because you know, the way you know that the moon is not the sun. You just know it. My teacher used to say, there's only one infallible measure of a great poem. And that is when you read it, the hair on the back of your neck stands up and you get tingles. It's the only way to know for sure. But when that happens, you can't be argued out of it. It's right there in front of you. Now, if you try to write the most complicated, convoluted, symbolic, significant thing you can possibly write, and people have tried to do it, and then someone sits down and analyzes it, and they go, this doesn't make any sense, or that image falls flat, or it's hard to do. This kind of unity of vision and depth of poetic significance is not accidental. It just doesn't happen by accident. It's like that idea of the monkey sitting around, typing 8,000 monkeys for 10,000 years and producing Shakespeare. They're not going to do it. It's just not going to happen. It doesn't matter how long they keep typing, because a mind is at work, and it is an extremely plastic, poetic, inventive, unifying, visionary mind, and you can see it when you actually sit down and look. So you can say and you can believe, I'm just making this all up, and then go see or hear or read the play, and you will not be able to walk away from it saying, yeah, well, it's a good story, but all that stuff they were saying, it's just imaginary. It's not. You will experience it in your empathic response. And that's partly why he's so great, because he incarnates, that Graham Huff's amazing word, he incarnates the meaning in the images, in the language, in the characters, in the plot, and it all comes together as a unified experience. And when you see that, you can't say no. It's like the Mary Magdalene walking by the house and look in the window, and there's Jesus, and she just stops and goes in, and that's it for the rest of her life. She's utterly transformed. And she doesn't have to, nobody has to argue with her. If they come and say, well, how do you know he's real? I mean, it might be Jim Jones giving you Kool-Aid, and she'll go, just look at him. It's just self-evident. You know what I'm saying? It's like Plato's image of the cave. You think that the shadows on the back of the wall, thrown by a bit of firelight, are reality. And then you come outside the cave and, the sun blinds you. There's no comparison. You don't go back to the cave thinking this is real. If you go back at all, you go back to get other people out, and of course then they kill you.
One of the things is when we do see Shakespeare, we have that tremendous empathic response. You have that experience of the poetry and everything. And as students, we want to go ahead and explore it. And it's been said before that when you try and dissect something, it usually dies in the process. You
Yeah.
can't survive. And so
We murder to dissect.
right. So it's hard because sometimes when we try and pull apart the poetry, you lose what.
It's true, but the great thing about great poetry, I tell this to my students, and I think it's true, and my experience is it's true, or I wouldn't have been able to keep teaching poetry, the same poems again and again. You take it apart in order to understand how greater minds than ours do it, and how it works, and what it means. Because it's moved us, and so we look at it. Or in the case of students, they're forced to by their teachers. But the great thing about a great poem is it pulls itself back together miraculously. And you read it again the next day or the next week, and pow, it hits you. And we English teachers hope, that now that you understand it even more, and know the allusions and the background and the structure and so on, now when it hits you as a more of a 3D experience. But you're absolutely right. In the moment you're taking it apart, nothing's happening. You're just getting intellectual comprehension. But when it comes back together, bang, it works if it's a great poem. If it's not a great poem, once you take it apart, you go, I see the folly there. I see the errors. I see the fakery. It doesn't work. And then you read it again, and it doesn't work. You've seen through it. That's a not great poem. A great poem, that doesn't happen to. You come back and you go, wow, I never saw that before. That makes it even better, you know. So why does it have that magic? I do not know. I mean, why is Shakespeare Shakespeare and no one else is? It's one of the great mysteries of the world. Why are you instead of somebody else? This we don't know. And people have tried to figure out and explain. And they go with the bicameral mind, and they go with, you know, background, nature, nurture, and study. And we can learn a lot. But the bottom line is, it's a mystery. And this is why the great poets have always invoked the muse before they start out on a big job, like writing Paradise Lost or something, because they know they can't do it on their own. It is not possible. It requires this combination of vision and talent and technique and stick-to-itiveness and all the rest to get through it and make it work and then have people want to read it. And when they succeed, they are grateful to the muse because they know that 2 weeks later, try to do it, you can't. You know, Milton tried to write Paradise Regained after Paradise Lost. It's not as good a poem. I mean, it's great because it's Milton, but it's not the same level. It's just, and nobody knows why. The muse was there, and sometimes she's there and sometimes she's not. Plato knew this. Plato said, it is the God who descends through the words of the poet, through the speaker, the performer, to the audience, and everybody is electrified and at the same time. And then sometimes the God doesn't appear, and then he's up there reading away and gesturing away, and everyone's going, ugh. Why? Well, it's the same words. Nobody knows why. Yes?
So, at the risk now of dissecting empathetic responses in all tragedies, why do you think it is in tragedies that we feel bad for the person after they've done whatever sin they've committed and they punish themselves for it? Do you think it's because we feel bad for another human being, or because we feel bad if we were in that position?
It's both. We feel bad for another human being because we are also a human being, and our whole experience of this person's actions and words and life on the stage is conveyed to us through our own empathic response. What does it feel like to feel like that? And the thing about Shakespeare's characters is that they're not just random individuals about whom we happen to read a story in the paper. They have something to say to every human being, because the issues that he is interested in dealing with, and of course the way he appeals to everyone in his audience, high, low, you know, smart, dumb, is by making it universal, by making it apply to all of us. And the greatest thing about him, I suppose, is that what was universal in his time for other playwrights isn't necessarily so universal for us. But what he did is still universal for us. And my whole effort in these lectures is to try to restore more of that experience, because we've lost a lot of what those plays mean in our time by coming at it with different points of view. But we're still doing Shakespeare every week. We're still reading and producing those plays, and people are still interpreting the hell out of them. So something's there beyond, any particular application or interpretation. I think there's more than most of the people in our time think, and that's why I'm busily up here trying to get that across. Against all odds, I may say. Yes?
In that vein, could you think a little bit and see whether there's any help or any illumination in contrasting Oedipus's reaction to his self-knowledge and Othello's reaction?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very fruitful contrast, because it's a contrast of two completely distinct views of the world and the nature of man. they're both tragic, and Shakespeare's tragedies wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for Sophocles' tragedies and the other ancient Greeks. Yes, but the difference is that Shakespeare's audience and Shakespeare's worldview is essentially a Christian worldview. He believes that God is good and God is love, and that man has free will, and that free will is an absolute unlimited, not unlimited, but what's the word? Inalienable gift of God. So that everything I'm trying to emphasize in this talk has been the responsibility of the individual for his choices. Now, in Sophocles, in the Oedipus play, we have this whole nexus of the convoluted question of fate and free will. And for Sophocles, they are the same thing. Mystically and mysteriously, they are the same thing. And so you make your choices thinking you're making your choices, and in fact, the choices you are making are fulfilling a pre-existing and foreknown fate. What does that mean? It's true, because we live in mystery, and every choice we make seems to be woven into a larger fabric that then seems inevitable to us. And so he is also universal, because he's speaking to our real experience. But overlaying that real experience of the mysterious relation between destiny or fate and our choices is the faith doctrine of the biblical tradition, and that is that God steps back and gives us that space where our choices really matter. And if they don't seem to matter in terms of worldly effect, they do matter, as we believe, in eternity. They do matter ultimately in the next world or the next life, or however you picture it, or in the eyes of God. So that it raises that freedom of the will to a much higher level of significance.
No shears of fate.
Right. It's not just fate. Hamlet's way of putting it, which we'll talk about next 2 weeks, is it? March 10th, Monday, March 10th. His way of saying it is, there's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. So we do the rough hewing, and divinity does the shaping. And we're both, the ends, meaning death and also purposes, involve both God's will, which is unknowable, and our own, which is our choices. But our choices are not made in no context at all. Neither are they absolute. It's this interrelation. And it's a much more Christian formulation of the mystery that Sophocles is dealing with. So yeah, you could draw a lot of comparisons and contrasts. And basically in those two plays, you have Western civilization, right? You have these two traditions, the classical and the biblical. And there you have them sort of side by side. Yeah, Athens and Jerusalem. Yeah. Good question. Others?
Do you think Screwtape would have fun with Iago and Othello?
Screwtape wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for Iago and Othello. C.S. Lewis knew this play very well. Yeah, I mean, Screwtape is Iago, really. It's a terrifying part, Iago. Philip Thompson said that if you're going to do Othello, you're either going to focus on Iago or you're going to focus on Othello. There are only those two ways of doing the play. I think the focus on Iago is probably a mistake. He's more interesting to the modern world than he might have been in the Renaissance, only because they were much more familiar with devils and read about them and knew about them and believed in them. And we don't. So we think, wow, a human being that behaves like that. So I think the real focus is Othello. But Iago is an amazing creation of Shakespeare. He is in a sense, the purest evocation of evil will in all Shakespeare, I would say. Goneril and Regan are pretty bad, but they're not demonic. They're not demons. They're bad, but they're not. But Iago is a kind of incarnated demon. At the end, when Othello tries to, just before his suicide, when they bring Iago in chained, he says, "I look down at thy feet, but that's a fable." He's looking at Iago's feet. And he says, "But that's a fable," meaning he's looking to see whether Iago has cloven hoofs. And then he says, "If thou beest a devil, I cannot kill thee." And he stabs him. And he doesn't kill him. So he is a devil, in a sense. I mean, that's why he doesn't die. That's part of the reason.
There are a lot of villains.
I'm sorry?
In all the plays, there are a lot of bad people. There's Lady Macbeth. And
Oh, yeah.
other people who do horrible.
But we get the sense that Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are both human beings who have made the consistently evil choice, and they go onward and downward marching towards hell in everything they do. And their suffering at the end is
It's like Iago came out of hell.
yeah, exactly.
And Lady Macbeth and her husband are marching. She's a good manager.
Yeah, well, yeah, up to a point.
Inspires people.
Up to a point.
But it's just all. But it's like Iago came out of hell.
Yeah, he's already completely formed in the beginning. He's 28 years old. He is a demon. And Edmund is human. The poor guy's a bastard. His father loves his brother more than him. He's been sent away. He's come back. There are reasons. And at the end, he converts. Don John is pretty thoroughly bad. But, he's choosing to be. He's not an incarnate demon. But Iago, when you read Iago's soliloquies, it's hair-raising. It's hair-raising. And especially if you've known someone like that. Because that is a real human possibility, even though he's an extreme and demonic. And it's rare. There are human beings that are like that. Yeah. It's not just they're evil because they have some cockamamie agenda. They want to hurt. They want to destroy. That is what they are. So that in a sense he is jealousy or envy incarnate. Not even so much a demon come from hell like a person, a fallen angel. He is a kind of incarnation of jealousy or of suspicion or envy. They're all similar morally, similar concepts. And so he's terrifying. And of course, he succeeds, which is the worst. And he doesn't die at the end. He's still here. He's still out there.